today's show, my name is Carolyn. I'm a creative entrepreneur who loves to analyze everything about the startup and tech world. Today, I'm going to focus on big tech, antitrust, and whether big companies like Facebook, Amazon, or Google can be considered monopolies. If you haven't already heard, there has been a lot of talk about whether some of the biggest tech companies in the world are actually monopolies and whether governments should be doing anything about it. China has been cracking down really aggressively, arguably too much so. Europe has been creating all sorts of different regulations for US tech firms and some of their own, and even in the US, politicians on both sides of the aisle are having conversations on whether or not new regulations need to be made, or even whether some of these big tech companies need to be broken up. And now with Biden's appointment of Lina Khan as the new FTC chairman, Silicon Valley has all eyes on Washington, with Facebook and Amazon both demanding that Lina Khan recuse herself from their cases. Now, I know what you're thinking, but Carolyn, don't you talk about startups? Why are you digging into big tech and antitrust law? Why should I care about antitrust and monopolies? The reality is, startups around the world are heavily impacted by big tech. Some of these impacts have been great, such as being able to teach yourself literally anything on Google or on YouTube, or being able to help grow your small business by using AWS's cloud servers. However, many big tech companies have been engaging in a lot of anti-competitive practices, making it nearly impossible for some startups to really get on their feet before being bought out or worse. Things are definitely getting tense, but do these politicians even have a case? Are these big tech companies monopolies? And even if they are, can we even do anything about it? We're gonna find out. We're gonna have some fun today. What? Here's what you need to know. To the moon! To the moon! Today, I'm going to break this down into a few key sections. I'm going to review the definitions of monopolies and antitrust, check out the main arguments that these companies are not monopolies, or at least are monopolies that shouldn't be broken up, introduce you to the new FTC chair Lina Khan, and talk a little bit about Amy Klobuchar's newest book, and my thoughts on big tech and monopolies. But first, why are people talking about this now? Why wasn't this something that people focused on even 3 to 5 years ago? Top tech companies are being targeted now because in some cases they've conquered their entire market, and in others they've engaged in really sketchy and not great anti-competitive practices. Amazon is probably the most obvious. Amazon has an over 50% hold on the US e-commerce market and has been accused of plenty of different anti-competitive practices. These include gleaning data from third-party sellers and using that to get more sales of their products versus their third-party sellers, and by favoring their own products over third-party sellers by making sure that those products get prime real estate on their website, and by manipulating the search results. They have also been accused of raising prices for third-party sellers just because they can, and that they penalize third-party sellers for selling their products on other platforms. Not cool, Amazon. We all need to diversify our incomes. Come on. Now, Facebook is a little different, but they have been uniquely aggressive, dominating over 75% of the social media market. Facebook's famous copy, acquire, and kill strategy that they use with their competitors has really put them in a bad light. Zuckerberg has been quoted many times in his own emails that have been leaked to the press that he would rather acquire a company rather than innovate to compete. This strategy was most notable with their acquisition of Instagram. After acquiring Instagram, there were dozens of leaked documents that indicated that Facebook intended to stymie Instagram's growth. They also blatantly stole Snapchat's concept and turned it into Insta stories and Facebook stories. Granted, like, everybody's done that now, but they were first and did it really early on. It was just kind of gross. And Google technically has the biggest monopoly, though I would say they don't appear to be as aggressive, at least from my perspective. Google has over 90% of the search market. And they've definitely taken advantage of that fact, and they've definitely taken advantage of the search results. First, they tried to undermine other search providers like Expedia and Yelp, other companies like that, by making sure that their content appeared higher up on the Google search bar, basically, than other potentially superior content. Second, they also pushed Android users to use Google-only apps and made it harder for customers to be able to find competitor apps on their app store. So yeah, these are the primary accusations that people have, but let's dig into the definition of monopolies and other people's arguments. Monopolies are companies or organizations who have exclusive ownership through legal privilege, command of supply, or concerted action. Or put more simply, monopolies are massive companies that take over entire marketplaces and make it so other companies can't even compete. You probably remember learning a little bit about monopolies in school, or maybe more specifically about how the US broke up Rockefeller's Standard Oil and other massive monopolies. These companies basically found ways to dominate entire marketplaces and built these massive trusts, aka big piles of money with all sorts of investors and whatnot, that they could use to buy out all of their competitors or any roadblocks or politicians that they encountered, and then they would raise prices exponentially. Because they could. On top of all that, these companies typically treated their employees at the very bottom, like, horrifically. Sometimes in conditions where people would die frequently. A bunch of employees would get things like lung cancer. I mean, the list goes on and on and on. Google it. Antitrust laws in the US were created to break up these trusts. Again, the big giant piles of money that these companies use to move all of the roadblocks that they ever encountered, and use this as a way to create more competition nationwide. A lot of the laws that were built around antitrust were designed to make it so these massive companies couldn't charge exorbitant fees or pay their way out of every situation. But nowadays, in some ways it's still true, but in some ways that doesn't really fit the moment that we're in right now. It's hard to claim that Google's a monopoly when all of their products are completely free and they've completely transformed the world. And also the fact that they haven't taken advantage of consumers financially. It's this understanding of antitrust law that leads some economists and politicians to believe that these companies are not monopolies, or at least that some of these massive companies who have entirely free services can't possibly be monopolies. The argument goes that if they're not price gouging or harming consumers in a different way, then it really doesn't matter if they're really dominating their sector. More competition is going to come in later. Theoretically, of course. You know, like Google may own 90% of the search market, but it doesn't matter. They're so great and everything is free, so why are we complaining, right? Shopping on Amazon is so convenient and cheap. Like, why would we want to get rid of that? Additionally, with some of these massive issues like cybersecurity and hate speech, and also just plain sheer convenience, wouldn't breaking up some of these companies put more of these smaller companies at risk for being hacked or not being able to handle all of these problems with hate speech or misinformation online? Wouldn't it be better to have these larger companies who are more equipped to hire more people to handle these types of problems? Wouldn't breaking up these companies lead to some unintended consequences? However, there is one person who has completely changed the conversation when it comes to big tech, antitrust, and monopolies. And that's Lina Khan. Lina Khan is an associate law professor at Columbia University and is the new head of the FTC, aka the Federal Trade Commission, the organization that was created in 1914 to take down the big trusts and monopolies back in the day. She's also 32 years old, so just 2 years older than me. Does that make us old or young? Both, right? Both. She rose to prominence in 2017 while a student at Yale Law School after writing a paper called Amazon's Antitrust Paradox. The paper focused on how and why these big tech companies are monopolies, how they're exploiting the system, and how the US's dated antitrust laws are unable to meet the moment and combat these companies. Khan primarily focused in on Amazon and how Amazon's artificially low prices are the reasons that Amazon became a monopoly. Traditionally, most monopolies in the US were defined as companies who were jacking up prices, basically making sure that they could take over an entire marketplace so they could charge consumers whatever they want. However, one strategy that they used to get there was by creating artificially low strategies that other companies couldn't compete with so that they could then raise those prices. Now, Amazon hasn't raised those prices on consumers just yet, but the argument here is they're using the same tactics as traditional monopolies to get to that point. So whenever Amazon wants, they could raise prices. Khan basically argues that even if Amazon doesn't raise their prices to take advantage of the consumers, they are still a monopoly because they have been able to completely take over their marketplace. Over 50% of all e-commerce in the US, that is massive, compared to every other company in the world is in the other 50%, okay? Like, it's huge, and they show no signs of slowing down. Khan has made similar arguments about other big tech companies like Facebook and Google, and that basically since they've been able to carve out their entire marketplaces and offer their services completely for free, other companies can't really compete because they're simply going to be outspent or acquired by these companies. As I mentioned earlier, Google has over 91% of the search market. The only other company that comes close to them is YouTube, which is owned by Google. They have virtually no competition. Facebook, meanwhile, has over 75% of the social media market and has been actively quoted as saying that he would rather buy out other companies than compete. In the past 15 years, Facebook has spent $23 billion acquiring their competitors, most notably Instagram and WhatsApp, and spent the rest of their time stealing other companies' ideas like Snapchat. They know that when it comes to social media, it's all or nothing. If all of your friends are on a platform, you are less likely to leave that platform, you are more likely to join that platform, and you are less likely to want to join a different one. And like I mentioned in my Clubhouse video a few weeks ago, it's remarkably easy for companies like Facebook to simply just copy or steal other startups' concepts. Clubhouse is an audio social media app that was really popular during January of 2021. It was one of those weird like pandemic fads. And after Twitter tried and failed to acquire them, companies like, well, Twitter, Spotify, Facebook, and many, many more started developing their own versions of that app to integrate onto their own platforms. Although this has happened before with companies like Snapchat and I mean many other different types of features, it was really wild to see how fast it happened. And now there's a pretty big question about whether or not Clubhouse is going to be able to succeed because of it. Khan basically states that just because a product is cheap or free doesn't mean that that company can't curate a monopolistic environment. After Khan's article came out, the world took notice. Okay, just legal nerds took notice and then they told their tech friends, who were then very concerned. When Biden appointed Lina Khan to become the FTC chair, Amazon and Facebook demanded that she recuse themselves from their cases, stating that she had a bias against their companies. And granted, these types of arguments have worked in the past. I mean, the whole reason you want an unbiased jury and why they have such difficulty getting juries for high-profile cases is because they want somebody with a fresh perspective to review the case and decide whether or not it's fair. As the FTC chair, Lina Khan's job is to, review all the facts and see whether or not these companies are violating things. But from my perspective, she's probably the biggest law expert in the field, other than Tim Wu, who of course she's working with. FTC chairs in the past several decades have been much more forgiving of big businesses than they have in the past, which is one of the reasons why we haven't seen massive antitrust cases since, AT&T. I don't know if I was alive for that. Maybe I was. But with Biden aligning himself with top lawyers in the space, including Lina Khan, including Tim Wu, and with other Democrats like Amy Klobuchar and Elizabeth Warren jumping in, it really seems like Biden is hoping to get something done about this. or at least is hoping to review the case and see if anything should be. Okay, so I recently read Amy Klobuchar's book on antitrust. Okay, correction, I read like half of it. It's really good, guys. I ran out of time reading it in time for filming it, so I'm going to finish it. I tried so hard. I even tried listening to the audiobook when I was on a road trip to see if that would help, but I didn't realize how long the audiobook was, so that did not help. But Senator Klobuchar's book focuses in on a few key areas. The entire US history of antitrust, which is very thorough, our current situation of monopolies and antitrust laws in the US right now, and her proposals on how to resolve those issues. Today, I'm gonna try to briefly cover the current situation because, oh my gosh, Amy Klobuchar does her homework, guys. It is so thorough. I really dug myself in a hole with this one, guys. Klobuchar argues that our antitrust situation in the US is in really bad shape right now for a multitude of reasons. So many reasons, in fact, that she has 12 core reasons, and it's like multiple pages for each reason. So I'll list them over here if you would like to take a look. So pause to read them because I'm not going to stay in this position for very long. But I'm going to break it down into two main categories: runaway big business and ineffective legal solutions. Let's start with runaway big business. Senator Klobuchar argues that big business consolidation has been increasing for the last few decades, and it's not just big tech. In fact, US market consolidation has shown an increase in more than 75% of industries. Klobuchar shares a whole bunch of different numbers from a whole variety of industries, including big tech. However, she breaks into a whole variety of different industries, including big pharma, agriculture, content, television, and news media, airlines, travel booking, and so much more. Under agriculture in particular, Monsanto owns 90% of genetic traits under most soybeans and 80% of corn. And if you're hoping to avoid monopolistic power when you're dying, good luck with that, because there are two coffin companies that own 82% of the coffin industry. Can't even escape it during death. Additionally, there are numerous industries that appear to be diverse on the surface, but are actually all owned by a smaller set of companies. Food is a pretty obvious one. I mean, try finding a cereal that isn't owned by General Mills or Kellogg's. But here's one that you may have not thought of. Travel booking websites. You know how there's like a million of them and they're all competing in your Google feed and you're like, oh God, which one do I choose? Well, it turns out there's just two companies that own almost all travel booking websites. Klobuchar also argues that the vast increases in market consolidation has also helped contribute to a big decrease in startups and small businesses being created in the US. It may not seem like it with how much startups are in the news and what's the coolest, newest, hottest startup, but the reality is Americans are building and creating less small businesses than they have in decades past. Interestingly, there has actually been a sharp increase in people building their own startups or small businesses during the pandemic. But you have to wonder two things. First, how many people were forced to create a business because of being laid off or fired due to COVID-19? It could be a pretty large number. And also, how many of these startups are going to continue to grow and exist after the pandemic is over or in the years to come? There's an ethos among venture capitalists and Silicon Valley in general that some of the best startup ideas are created during recessions. We've seen some pretty impressive companies come out of the 2001 tech bubble and the 2008 recession. However, a lot of companies that are started during recessions don't succeed over time. And companies that were started during stabler times statistically see more successes, even if perhaps recessions create more innovative companies that become bigger over time. The vast majority of companies that are started during recessions don't last. And let's not forget the ineffective legal solutions. Klobuchar proposes that a whole host of different legal issues also contributed to the vast amount of monopolies that we have today. This includes a lack of enforcement due to a lack of funding and manpower from the FTC. The FTC only has about 1,000 employees, and when you compare that to the size of companies like Google or Amazon or Facebook's legal team, it's hard to compete. A big business-friendly Supreme Court and other courts around the country. A lack of political willpower, which, yeah, makes sense. Deep-pocketed lobbyists who wield far more power than they probably should. And simply just how complicated antitrust has become with international acquisitions and the changing nature of business in the United States and the world. It's hard enough to push a successful antitrust case through court, and it's harder even still to make more cases that maybe should happen to happen in the first place. Nobody wants to deal with it. With a lack of practical legal tools and big businesses just taking advantage of that fact, Klobuchar argues that this situation is really bad now and is going to get worse over time. Consumers may be happy now with free services and whatnot, but if these companies aren't able to be regulated properly, if they start raising their prices, or if we run into more issues with misinformation, all sorts of different things, we are going to see a lot of these problems go from bad to a whole lot worse. Okay, enough with all of the fun facts. My gosh, there were so many of them. What do I think? If it wasn't obvious enough, I'm definitely on team Lina Khan and Amy Klobuchar. Our tech overlords are just that. Our overlords. They are one of our largest exports in the world and completely dominate the US economy. Google, Amazon, and Facebook all have so much cash on hand that they can basically do whatever they want. And no one is really holding them accountable in a major way. You know, there's hardly any legislation when it comes to regulating what companies can do with our data, how to handle hate speech and online abuse, what to do about misinformation or anything in that realm. However, and this is probably where I differ with some people, I am not sure that all of these companies need to be or should be broken up, though I probably could be persuaded to go either way. For some of these companies, I think it would probably be relatively simple to break them up. Well, not simple, but, you know, simpler than an alternative, I guess. However, I also think that there could be massive unintended consequences that could lead to a worse customer experience and potentially really negative experiences overall. Plus, some of these companies have massive earnings, but they also run other companies that wouldn't exist if it wasn't for all of that extra cash. You know, for well over a decade, YouTube has struggled with profitability on and off over the years. However, since Google bought out the company, they were able to take their time building their product, figuring out what worked and what didn't. And now they're able to help support creators, not like myself, I don't have enough followers, subscribe, but they're able to support creators from all around the world who do things like this video. But at the same time, YouTube has also dominated the video space for over a decade because they were just getting free cash from Google for years, even though they weren't necessarily profitable. Other companies couldn't compete. Luckily for Google, now that investment seems to be completely worth it, as YouTube is now matching profits with companies like Netflix and is becoming a real powerhouse. I mean, it's always been a powerhouse on the internet, but it hasn't always been taken very seriously by, you know, the big dogs in Hollywood and things like that. Plus, all three companies have all sorts of different programs for startups and entrepreneurs. Google has a whole program for nonprofits to make SEO way cheaper. And all sorts of really great things. Breaking up some of these companies might make it so some of these smaller companies that are doing some real good in the world couldn't exist in the future. Now, I could be completely wrong on this. Surprise, surprise, I'm not an expert on antitrust. It's true. Nor do I know what exactly happens when a company is broken up. And that's probably why I'm a little more nervous about it. So from my perspective, as somebody who works in the startup tech adjacent world, I think that having much better and clearer regulations, doing a full review, and potentially putting in some new programs in place could help get rid of a lot of the problems that we are experiencing and maybe be the first step to evaluating, does anything need to be done about these big monopolies? And honestly, that's what these big tech giants want. Facebook in particular has been releasing all those ads. I don't know if you see them. I see them all the time about how internet regulations haven't changed since 1996. And then they find like a random person who was born in 1996. And they're like, look, this person is a fully grown adult and the internet regulations haven't been updated since they were born. Guys, seriously, internet regulations haven't been really updated since 1996, which means that like every single TikTok star that you know and follow has been alive for less time than those internet regulations. What? No one is holding these tech companies accountable in the ways that they really need to be. And without clear legislation and a well-funded, well-staffed FTC to really regulate the industry, we're in for a lot more issues with big tech and other big monopolies in our economy. I mean, can you imagine if Congress was actually competent enough to do all sorts of different things, like pass legislation that does things like stop or deter online hate speech or abuse? What companies can and can't do with your data? And who owns that data? Do you own the data? Because if so, you should be making a lot of money because these companies are selling your data on a day-to-day basis. Misinformation and fake news in general. Probably some cool anti-competitive or antitrust laws that I don't really know about because I'm not an expert. Like, guys, there are so many potential things that we could be doing that we haven't done because our government is ancient and slow and doesn't know how the internet works. I think what I would most love to see is some just well thought out, simple legislation that is able to be very applicable and that companies are given enough time to, adjust their strategies and whatnot. I mean, that's so easy for me to say, right? Like, oh, just create cool new simple laws that solve all of our problems. Oh gosh, every lawyer in the room hates me, huh? I mean, overall, everybody has a ton of work cut out for them. But that's what happens when laws don't change for 20 years. But yeah, overall, I'm really excited with Lina Khan's work. I'm really excited that Amy Klobuchar has been so aggressive on everything. Go Minnesota, gotta love it. And I'm really impressed with the team that Biden has put together. I don't know whether they're actually gonna be able to get anything done because who knows if our government can actually do anything, but it's nice to see that they at least have some of the top people in their fields who have been taking this seriously, who understand the space in positions of power to potentially do something about it. So I'm hoping that these words don't bite me in the butt someday, because I'm not a fan of unnecessary legislation. I think a lot of times there are laws that were made for the right reasons but are dumb. And I especially do not want to stifle innovation. But the reality is, the way I see it, some of these companies are so massive that people aren't even interested in attempting to compete. And the ones who are typically laughed at or have tremendous difficulty getting funding from venture capital or other investors. Additionally, and this may be harder than, dealing with DC, but I think there does need to be some sort of at least a small culture shift when it comes to monopolies and competitive behavior in the startup space. I mean, Peter Thiel, a really famous venture capitalist, is remarkably famous for saying that all startups should aspire to be monopolies and partake in monopolistic behavior. Yeah. So, it's just not great. It's the type of thing where I see a culture mismatch when it comes to Silicon Valley of what consumers actually want and what would actually be good for people versus what Silicon Valley wants. But yeah, in the end, I think we're in for a messy time. It's going to be really interesting to watch this space. I'm thinking that we are probably going to be seeing some big changes in the next year or so. If anything is going to happen, it's probably going to be happening sooner rather than later, as long as, Biden has a Democratic Congress. So we'll see if anything happens. I'm definitely going to be paying attention. But yeah, thank you so much for watching. I hope you like my new setup. This is actually my office. I'm at home. I just never decorated my office accordingly for the camera before. I actually reorganized this entire room. And yeah, I hope you like it. Let me know if you have any notes for it. But yeah, seriously, if you liked this video, please like and subscribe. I am brand new on YouTube, and if you are lucky, you could be my 50th subscriber. I have 49 subscribers this morning. This video is coming out. And yeah, you could be number 50. Also, I haven't done a broader topic video like this before, so if you like this, let me know in the comments. I think it might be a nice mix to do things like startup, 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 big broad topic, startup, 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 big broad topic. I hope you enjoyed this video. I would love to know your thoughts, so please feel free to comment down below. Would love to hear if you agree with me, if you disagree with me, if you think I'm absolutely ridiculous, or if there's anything I missed. Again, I didn't finish Amy Klobuchar's book. I might have missed something. But yeah, thank you so much for watching. I post videos on Tuesdays. Theoretically, I don't know if this video is gonna make it on time for Tuesday. It might be a Wednesday video. Surprise! All right, thank you so much again. Bye.